Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's a beautiful evening, so we're really happy that you're joining us here tonight for the Artist Talk with Nestor Topchy and Timothy Morton. We'd like to thank the Cockerell Family Fund for their support of this program. And our next Artist Talk is going to be on November 9th with Robert Gober, so we hope you can join us for that as well. And I hope you've all had a chance to see the exhibition, The Iconic Portrait Strand by Nestor Topchy, curated by Michelle White. It's up through January 21st. It has 124 paintings from Nestor's portraits that he's been working on for over 15 years. And also, as part of our public programs, Nestor has had a studio on site here at the Menil, and we've had 2 open studio events so far. We have one more on November 4th. And that will be the 3rd and final one, so be sure to come and visit Nestor in his studio here. And on Thursday, November 2nd, we're having a special event with Houston Poet Laureate Emeritus Outspoken Bean and the Brave New Voices 2023 Poetry Slam champions, Adriana, Mayan, and Samaya. And they're going to be responding to works from the exhibition Longing, Grief, and Spirituality, Art Since 1980, which is also on view right now. So the iconic portraits that are on view are really a small slice of Nestor's very expansive artistic practice. He works with painting, sculpture, installation, and performance. He's a longtime Houstonian and the founder and creative director of Hive, the Habitable Interdisciplinary Visionary Environment. And you can say that fast 5 times, that'd be amazing. He's exhibited widely, nationally and internationally. And his work is influenced by Zen philosophy, Ukrainian folk art, sacred geometry, and the historical language of the Dada art movement. Timothy Morton, who's going to be joining him tonight, is the Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University. He's collaborated with Bjork, Laurie Anderson, Sabrina Scott, Anna McKay, Olafur Eliasson, and Pharrell Williams. How amazing would that be to have a dinner with all those people? He co-wrote and appears in the film The Living Futures Past. It's about global warming, and it was with Jeff Bridges. And he's authored the libretto for opera Time, Time, Time by Jennifer Walsh. He's authored 17 books, some 250 essays on philosophy, ecology, literature, music, art, architecture, design, and food. So tonight you're in for a real treat as these 2 talk together for the next bit, and I'm going to turn it over to them now. We will have questions afterwards, so if you can hold your questions until we have our Q&A, and we'll pass mics around, etc. And please also silence your cell phones. So Nestor and Tim, do you want to head on up? Thanks.
Good evening, Houston. Crash. Okay. Would you like some fizzy? I'm not supposed to look at him when I'm talking. This separation thing. Nestor, would you like some fizzy water?
I would, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thanks for laughing. It's very good for my ego. So Nestor, the fact that I can't really look at you when I'm talking is a real thing. But, you know, the funny thing, and that reminds me of an art exhibition a couple of doors down from here, where you go in the room. I don't know about you guys, but I was absolutely blown away by Nestor's art when I went in that room. And I go in there frequently. You know, I'm very lucky to live just across the street, and I sort of go in there mostly for kind of sort of healing purposes, actually. And one of the reasons why I go in there for that reason is because it's kind of like you're not looking at those pictures, they're looking at you, right? It's like it's like everything you wanted out of social media, but you never ever got, right? Like this little tiny square with the little pictures, and you're the very special guest star on a very special kind of religious version of the Muppet Show. Right? And it's like they're all looking at you and you're being seen, right? Really quite deeply seen, I think. And I find this profoundly soothing and healing. Thank you very much, Nestor.
You got the Muppets right out front. Yep. A friend of mine said I was a medieval Facebooker, but when I think of these portraits, I started intuitively and found that I needed to find a way of working that wasn't overly romantic. It was something like a meditation, something really authentic. And I thought that nothingness was probably the best way to leave room for reality. So I asked myself, what were these things that I had been making, and where did they come from? And some of them, like the large spheres that I'd been making for many years, and I had shown here, Hiram Butler, Josh Posda Gallery, early on, in the early 80s, maybe 87, 88, late 80s. And I thought, these must be the eggs. These must be the pisanki, which are Ukrainian Easter eggs. And this is an art form I learned from my grandmother and my mother, and it's something practiced so long ago. It's Neolithic. And the traces of it have been sort of emerged from just fragments of pottery that you could see the designs in. And those designs are syncretic. Later, after thousands and thousands of years, when Christianity arose, those same symbols had a layer of other meanings attached to them and built up. And the egg is like, it comes before the chicken. The egg is a simple, single module, and it grows in gathering complexity. So, like starting with the egg, starting with one point that expands in a circle, like the spheres, these portraits were sort of similar. They came from someplace familiar to me, but at the same time, I had to find them as a living thing now. And so I had to go with phenomena. I had to go with something that I could see, something that I could actually see the way everybody else sees and compare our experience, sort of an empiricism that I wanted. And this sounds kind of like I'm getting to it. Yeah, I am. The portraits are geometric. We don't see these squares and these shapes because they're ubiquitous and we just don't see them anymore. It's like respect, I think in Latin means to see again, right? So there are shapes in the exhibition that are geometric, all of them.
Mm-hmm. Nestor, they're geometric, but we were talking last night about how that doesn't mean abstract at all, right? Like the original geometry, yeah, the kind that Plato was all about, right? Like above the entrance to the academy in ancient Greece, there was a little sign that basically said, don't even think of coming in here unless you are, and then the word is geometrikos, right? Which kind of means geometried up, yeah? And that didn't mean using numbers, it meant actually you're forbidden from using numbers, you just have to do it by feel, right? You have a straight edge, right, with a plumb line, and then you have a pair of compasses. Can you solve problems using only a straight edge and a pair of compasses? And if you think about it, that's a very contemplative thing. Geometry literally just means you're pacing the earth, right? And there are two people who I like very much who did things like that, with sort of touching the earth, right? Like, actually three people. When Siddhartha achieved enlightenment, he touched the earth, right? Just before Mary of Magdala was about to be stoned to death for adultery, Jesus was just doodling in the sand. And there's also an episode with Socrates doing this sort of doodling in the sand, making a sort of connection, right? So geometry is literally your body and how your body relates to a kind of space, but it's not a kind of void space anymore, right? Right, Nestor, who I can't look at?
It's kinesthetic. Yeah. It is. It's the body moving through space. It's an incarnation of matter that is mostly space, mostly little pieces of energy that are spread apart in nothingness. And yet we put them together with our body and our mind, our body-mind, and everything that we have that we bring to the occasion. And we think this is it. But really, the human brain that sees, using the wetware, using the eyes, sees a very narrow focal point. Like right now when I'm looking at you, I might see one of you at a time, just a little bit of each of you, but everywhere else it's blurry. And then as I move around, I put these pieces together. And if I could see all of you at once for a longer period of time, my brain would have to be about the size of the biggest Texas pumpkin. It would be full of a huge amount of blood, enough oxygen ripping through there, and this huge kind of armature of a body to hold it up, to hold it from the neck from breaking. And everything. There's so much energy required to perceive what's around us that we're this perfect sort of reduction in a way. And we have this beautiful imagination and faith in what we're seeing right now based on what's gone and what's not here yet, which is right now, that we are able to put it together in a picture right here and right now. So with these portraits,
yeah. Am I supposed to say a thing here?
maybe,
With
yeah.
these
if you
portraits,
trip, I'll pick it up.
And with these portraits, Nestor changed the world. Because, thank you for laughing, but it's true, right? Like, any work of art is a direct intervention in causality itself, right? You're creating a different reality. And the thing about icons traditionally is that they're alive, right? They're living, breathing beings. And I'm coming back to this sense of when you go in that room, it's kind of like you are the sort of the void space in the middle, and you can sort of sit there and just sort of be seen by people that you don't know, but you know they're friends of Nestor, right? So there is this, I think Nestor said uncanny a few minutes ago, and it's sort of like, this work is profoundly uncanny in a very gentle way, right? And it's sort of like, when you meet somebody new, there's always that slight feeling of, do I know you? Or how can I get to know you better, right? There's this difference between a kind of a stranger, yeah, the possibility of a stranger, or a very rigid concept of alien, you know? And it's this sort of idea of like, we're here and the aliens are there, whether they're sort of up there or over there somewhere. Maybe this isn't so great. And maybe one of the things that Nestor's doing in this room is he's kind of enabling you to see other people as strangers in a more kind of uncanny way. And if I do enough of these gestures, you'll be totally hypnotized and you won't be able to think about what I'm saying, which is just a little bit, but maybe I'll warm up in a minute. Thank you. I've been Timothy Morton.
You touched on that mystery in as much as you can, because it's a mystery. And we love knowing things. We like knowing good things, good news, bad news. We like that. But we don't like not knowing. It makes us really uneasy. It makes us really uncomfortable. And it's sort of like that zone is the space where the uncanny happens. And that's the zone that I like. I mean, this is my favorite museum. In addition to this, there are funeral homes that are great places to put artwork because people don't know what is going on. And that means they have a genuine experience. In the same way, I tripped myself up when I went into this with the portraits, because when you said uncanny, well, yes, and mystery, yes. The uncanny is that sort of vibration between poles. And it's a sort of a place where your balance is your job. Because when you look at the work, and most contemporary artwork, yes, is this way, where you're confronted with yourself when you're observing it, yes. But this especially, I think, when you have something that's an image that's considered in a way a representation, but really all artwork is an abstraction. It's a reduction in this way, and it's a thing that triggers our emotion, and it can be beautiful, which doesn't mean it's good or true. It just means it arrests us, it stops us, and it puts us in this sort of space where we can't really. It's like not. It's not moving, not moving, not. Not coming, not going, not moving, not dwelling.
You know what it is, Nestor? It's this edge between, is it an edge or is it a kind of really fuzzy boundary? What is it between the thing called art and the thing called religion? And it's something that I love about the Menil collection very, very much. And I'm writing a book about Christianity right now, so this resonance between what Nestor's doing and what I'm doing is extraordinary, and it's a beautiful coincidence. But you know, I don't know about you, but whenever I go in that Rothko chapel, I have a very profound experience. You know, I have some colleagues and friends. I've got an experiment running, and maybe you can do this for me as well. Some people, not naming any names, who think, for whatever reason, that art is a little bit evil, right? For whatever reason, like it's ideological, or it indoctrinates you, or it makes you have an experience that you didn't want, you know, all that stuff, right? Look, so it's kind of Plato thought that art was a little bit evil, yeah. People who think that a lot, you know, they go in that room, they have to be out of that room in under 2 minutes, 30 seconds. I've timed it. 2 minutes, 30 seconds, like, get me out of here. And I think the reason why, and Nestor was just speaking to it, it's not a chapel, but it's not an art gallery either. You can't delete the experience, which is very genuinely happening to you, because you can't put it in a little box of religion or a little box of art. It's something much more real than that. And that, I also get this feeling in Nestor's room there. But my feeling in that chapel is extreme warmth. You know, I have a feeling of tremendous intimacy and warmth when I go in there. And I could be in there for hours. And I brought my friend Björk, you know, this pop singer called Björk. And we went in the Rothko Chapel. It was about 2018, I think. She was here to do a show. And of course, she loved it, right? And she lay in there with her arms spread out for like 45 minutes, yeah, with Arka, our friend Arka. And it's sort of like this, right? Like part of what is religious about it is that it's on the edge of something almost scary. It's more physical than your average art. That's the funny thing about religion. It's actually talking to something very physical, I think. That's kind of unspeakable physical. Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah. I started by studying with iconographers to write an icon, to make an icon. And from there, I realized that it would be an okay thing to do a portrait. So I did a portrait of my daughter. And then I thought, you know, there's something here. I really love these giottos and these Duccios and these paintings that are proto-Renaissance paintings, these paintings that hover between when in the West a history of icon making went to the Renaissance. And in that gap between the two, there was an uncanny place, a place where something was two things and one thing at the same time, or not quite either. And that felt somehow like me, too, being parts of different cultures and different, you know, approximations or denominations. If you look at the Buddhic way to talk about identity and start peeling an onion, and you can't really find yourself if you look at just one part at a time. It's rather this constellation of things that get together in conjunction with other constellations and people. So I thought of this sort of strand of portraits when I started putting them on the shelf in the studio as a social, cultural DNA somehow, in a personal way, that I could spend a little bit of time with the sitter and draw them, take a photograph for a reference, and then slowly work on these paintings and just continue and continue. And like being lost in the woods, if you put a string down or something, I knew where I would be the next day because I could look at the work and see what I had done. And so there wasn't any more anxiety or anything, you know? It was a way to stop and start anywhere. And so it became this tremendous freedom. And I realized that there's a lot of ways to sort of find freedom. And for me, this was a really good one.
I don't use the word mind anymore, Nestor. Nestor and I study a little bit Buddhism. And in Buddhist literature in the West, there's this word mind. But whenever I hear the word mind, I also hear the word body, and I think of the mind as different from the body, and it's just this sort of snap prejudice thing. And when you've got mind and body, you've also got subject and object, and then therefore you've got master and slave. And if you don't like that, you might want to go into some kind of a different place, right? And so one of the things I love about this conversation that you're having with Christian art here is that it's very soulful. Like, I actually really like to use the word soul now. I use the word soul in my writing, because even the corny kind of Scooby-Doo smoke in a bottle version of soul is somewhat physical and tangible, right? Like, and what if soul was like everything you ever did, everything you ever touched, everything you ever spoke to, all the thoughts you had and all the places you went and everything, that this kind of multi-dimensional thing that's much bigger than your sense of yourself, right? You can't wrap yourself around it. Hence the notion of grief. Grief is the one emotion. Thank goodness there's at least one emotion that you cannot get on top of. Yeah, I'm very against like Plato's idea that you're the charioteer and you're kind of riding these horses, and the horses are the emotions and you're the slave driver / charioteer, right? I was doing this dieting app. As you can see, I stopped doing the dieting app. I had a really good time on the dieting app, but halfway through, they blew it. It was a little kind of Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder, right, telling you handy little hints, like, have you ever considered eating a crunchy vegetable, maybe, slightly? And without any guilt, right, but halfway through, they blew it because they said, tame your inner elephant, right? And that was just after they'd said babies actually spontaneously eat the right amount of food. So what's this inner elephant, and why do you need to tame it? It spontaneously knows what to eat. I'd rather talk to the guy who thinks they're the driver, right? The guy who thinks they're the driver of the elephant is kind of more the problem, right? And in a way, that's what these pictures are doing. They're talking to your sense of yourself as the driver. You end up, it's like you're listening with your eyes. Nestor's talked about the eyes a lot, and what I get from this is that, in a way, we talk about ideas, and ideas are actually coming from a Greek word that meaning a thing that you can see, like a visual or a vision. And when you think something's true, you go, I see, and you don't say, I smell. You don't even say, I hear, which suggests some kind of slight doubt, possibility, or I sympathize with you, but I don't agree with you, right? Nestor's all about listening with your eyes as opposed to seeing in this kind of command-control way, right? And what happens for me between icons and the Renaissance is this kind of ballistics thing, where you get this kind of perspective where you're just kind of aiming at a thing with this weaponry of your eye, right? There's a long history of that as a technology that was devised to, right, like get around the Cape of Good Hope so you could go and colonize the Spice Islands and get the spices. I wrote a book about it a long time ago in a much more nervous version of myself, where I was trying to write like everything at once, so it's really illegible. But I like the title. It's called The Poetics of Spice, which I stole off a French dude called Gaston Bachelard. But it was the spice race in the same way that it's the space race, right? Elon Musk wants these asteroids. They wanted these floating islands. They thought they were floating. If they could attach a chain to them, this is literally in the literature, pull them towards Europe somehow, get all the goodies, right? These paintings aren't that. You're not going out towards them with this kind of hungry command control eyes, right? They are attending to you, and you start to realize actually acting isn't the same thing as hitting an elephant. Acting is much more like listening, right? Like if you've ever been in a band or cooked a meal with somebody, you'll know that, or just cooked a meal with food, you'll know that it's about attending to and listening to, and what does this carrot want right now? You're thinking, I shouldn't come into Tim's kitchen because he talks to carrots. Yeah. Thanks for not laughing about that at all. That was very unfunny.
Do you think there's a kind of uncanny synesthesia, Timothy?
I think there is synesthesia, and I think it's definitely uncanny whenever I have it.
Because you mentioned light, and with eyes that's light is so important to us. And eyes can see so far, and aided with telescopes and with spectronomy, you can see what's out there. You can touch what's out there with light by seeing the divisions between things that are joined together, kind of like the DNA has these sections and then there's spaces in them, so it has a signature in a way. But the light I was interested in with these paintings is not the light that falls on an object so much as it is an inner light. And I think that also comes from that comes from an icon. There are elements in these that come from that practice and that faith and that orthodoxy. And then there's elements that are not coming from those things. So I want to make sure that there's a differentiation, there's a distinction between the two. But the inner light that comes from these is something that comes from a sort of order. And that means that the paints are already in the tray, and I've already decided which colors are going to go from dark to light and are separated by the layers of protein in the tempera and the egg yolk. So they actually create a topography that you can see. And they're the grandfather and the grandmothers of, painting where you have glazing, the Western style paintings with the transparent layers in Venice and stuff like that. So this is like, these are the roots of that kind of painting. I wanted to go back as far and, as I could. There was something personal that I could touch. So these also move in a way when light changes according to where you're standing in relation to the work. So position will change the work. Your position to the work will create, either a dark silhouette or a bright. The countenance of the sitter, of the person, shows brightly, and then the gold is not in the light. So this quality of knowing something with eyes is that's the structure of art that we can perceive, I think.
Poor little eyes, right? What did they do to deserve this very alienating thing that happened to them? Because really they're just little wet baggies. They're soft little wet things. And I think that these pictures allow your senses to be sort of soft and moist like that. They sort of moisturize you, We were talking yesterday about religion and how it relates to your work, Nestor, and we were sort of coming to this conclusion that actually, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all share this thing about how to work with the stranger, right? It's like how to be hospitable. How to be the host, right? Host is such a great word because it can mean enemy. Hostis means enemy in Latin, but it can also mean friend, right, as in hospitality. It can also mean guest, right? It can also mean the hosting. Yeah. Why is it the word used in the notion of the Eucharist? Because it's all of these things. It's sort of uncanny that way, right? And these pictures are hosting you. And I would go so far as to say that, how sometimes things that come chronologically after something actually say something deep about that something. So Nestor's pictures come chronologically a long time after icons, but they sure do say something incredibly deep about that lineage, right? Which is that it's fundamentally about how do you work with strangers. Like imagine like someone who was a saint, but only we know they're a saint with 20/20 hindsight. They didn't know. The people around them didn't necessarily know. They were just sort of people interacting, right? And when you get in this room, it's like you're privileged to have a very primordial experience that is very much to me like the juice of where all the good stuff in religion comes from.
And the shadow in this, I noticed, that there was something familiar in some of the portraits early on, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And then I said, "Oh, it's Mao," and it's a lot of propaganda posters that came out of Russia, and portrayal of Uncle Joe, and there were posters of National Socialism that copied some of the compositions and the way the figure, the lionized or the idealized hero of the revolution, in a way, looked. And I thought, this is kind of disturbing. And why is this? And it seemed like, and then I got to, geek out. I got to look back and say, well, what happened in our history, and what happened in making things, and the history of cultures making things for a while that would lead to that. And it seemed like there was a jump in Russia and in China that didn't really include the Renaissance at all, and that sort of like along a few hundred years of 1500 up to 1900 of the tradition of a narration or a history painting or a story painting, and the fragments that came out of that, which would be like the landscapes and the still lifes and all these things, and even sort of a naturalism that happened in the Netherlands. So where did it come from? And it seemed like they jumped right from an icon to a poster, and the same in China with a tradition of brush painting and this, and gongbi, hard-edged, figuration. But mostly this was calligraphy, which was as or more important than depicting a natural object. So it just sort of jumped to, maybe there was an appreciation of French academic painting in Russia, but not much else. So boom, it jumped to this sort of naturalism, and they had this kind of idealized quality that was, maybe the angles were tipped up more, so they were, three-quarter view and then their chin up, to be like real proud, right? Which was proud, that didn't show up at all until then. Pride really came along, and look what it did. So, but not to digress, somehow there's a quality in these of confrontation, or maybe that's a confrontation with my own self. We, as an artist, we are always doing a self-portrait. It doesn't matter what we're doing. It's still coming from this hairy bag of water is doing this, and our psychology is in it. So that was something that I noticed, and as a phenomena, these things have that, and they can also sort of make all of what we consider to be gone time, present time. So they kind of don't forget, in a way. The structure sort of brings up,
I introduced my son, Simon. Hello, Simon. I introduced Simon to Apocalypse Now a couple of weeks ago. Very scared to do that. Very disturbing film. I hadn't seen it since the mid-90s. I watched it. Oh, my good Lord. It's even worse than I thought it was. And dear. And, now that you've said this thing about icons and dictators, I'm thinking about cult leaders, and how there is a shot or two of Kurtz, Marlon Brando, in that film where he's a little bit like chin up and kind of slightly three-quarter. And he could be, technically, Nestor, in the room. But honestly, dude, I don't think there's a space for that aggression in that room. I think what you're doing here is destructuring that possibility, so that really these are icons that cannot hurt anybody. I'm really interested in taking ideas and kind of bending them and kind of pushing them and pulling them so that they don't hurt anybody anymore. That's really what deconstruct actually means, right? Like deconstruction in the lineage of Jacques Derrida. You're not destroying something, you're destructuring it, right? Like you're taking Renaissance art, right, and you're kind of destructuring it into this more medieval thing, yeah? You're not getting rid of it. So there's this kind of uneasy quality, but the uneasy isn't going to hurt you. At least that's what I'm getting there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I just knew that if I had changed the composition, it would have gone whoops right into that. So, I was aware of the sort of parameters and what could happen if it went this way or this way or this way or this way. So I wanted that Goldilocks spot. And I didn't name it. It wasn't like an intellectual decision. It was rather what felt right. And that gets also to part of the beautiful part of orthodoxy and other sort of Jesus inks or, Buddha ink or different sort of dogmas. But more than that, the real practice, which is mystery, which is that
for real
that place that's not nameable, and that place that we know feels right because all aspects that we're bringing to it concur that wow, there's an arrest there. There's something. And we have to trust that because the training has gotten us to this point. Yeah.
For real. The word mystery comes from a Greek word muein, right? And the word muein does what it says, right? Like it's good. When you say it, you're going, you can't speak, right? Muein means to close the lips and go, things that make you go, right? Mystery means the unspeakable quality, right? Like I'm always aiming for, in my writing and my speech, as you can probably tell, it's the unspeakable bit, right? Like trying to aim for something that's very, like it's there, but you can't put your finger on it, you can't sort of name it, right? Like a demon, if you find the name, they get destroyed, right? But this is not demonic, this is actually divine, and to some extent, therefore, unspeakable, right? Like all the people that I really like are on the side of mystery, right? Like, you know how math is better than logic? You know that, right? Math is better than logic. Math is from the future. Logic is from the past. Logic is like folding your laundry. Math is like wearing clothes, right? And there were these logicians who were really seriously objected to something that this one mathematician was doing because they're like, you can't say that, that's illogical. This guy was a Jewish mathematician called George Cantor, and he had discovered layers of infinity even bigger than normal vanilla infinity. And these logicians, Russell and White, were like, you can't do that, that's not allowed. So they created all these rules. And then along came this Catholic mathematician called Kurt Gödel, and he said, I'll take your rules, I'm going to bend them into a nice little mathematical pretzel and allow them to talk absolute blank, right? And so math was able to turn those logical propositions into something mysterious, which was really weird for those guys because they had spent 400 pages proving that 1 + 1 is 2, and they did it, right? His point was that a logical system, in order to be true, has to be able to talk nonsense at least one level, right? And like, in a certain way, maybe one reason why Mao et al. Used this kind of format is whoever controls the nonsense controls the world. Wouldn't you agree? Like, when Imperial Britain got really powerful, nonsense stuff was the order of the day, right? I am the very model of a modern major general. I can do anything to anything. I can just do nonsense, right? Whoever controls the nonsense controls the world. And so I feel like a lot of art is like trying to work with nonsense. It doesn't sound like anything, right? But actually, maybe it's the most profound possible thing you could do. And one reason why a group like Pussy Riot is very threatening to somebody like Putin is that they're all about controlling the nonsense, right? And he's all about controlling the nonsense, yeah? And so those sorts of guys are the threatening guys. And I would personally think that the gentleness in this, that it's nonsensical to be gentle, right? It makes much more sense to be aggressive, but somehow, like, the gentleness here is actually remorseless in its taking apart of a lot of bad stuff inside of me.
There was an opportunity when working with curators that was great, that hadn't happened. And we started setting out the portraits, and sometimes there were people that were a couple. They were either married, or they were one was maybe a mentor for the other, maybe they were a father and son. They had a relationship in a way. And so we found that by using a meter, like in music, the portraits were on these shelves, that if we moved two of them together, it would imply a relationship. So now we had this sort of situation where we could do that with all of them. And so we found these sets and these subsets and these sort of organizations that are very subtle, and we had no idea what those were coming from. They just, on the spur of setting the work up.
Gosh.
And then, of course, there's things where I like to say, I like Louis Kahn, where he says a brick wants to be an arch, That makes so much sense to me, because these things will speak to you, and even in their making, when you're painting the portrait, everything about the size of drawing that goes on the board, and each one is unique, and each one tells you what it wants to be. So you don't really have to think about it. You just get what's right each time, including the lighting, because this technology needed candlelight pretty much, and it also needed natural light in a very narrow spectrum that would break through darkness in these chapels. So to equivalate that, we would use a dark room. And, I was on to some of this in the studio where I had the shelf, but to actually have it come to fruition gives us now we have a precedent. Now we have a way to show the work elsewhere that's already established as like how it really should be presented in
Nestor,
the architecture.
You know what Nestor's talking about right now? Nestor's talking about groups. Do I have a minute to say this before we go to the Q&A? Because this is really, really important. Yeah. So an arch is a group of bricks, right? And these paintings are in groups, and they're interesting groups because they can be you can be a member of different sorts of groups, and they can sort of overlap. That's what I'm hearing here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, Sigmund Freud says something very doomy about groups, which I agree with, which is that basically groups, all of them have, unless you work on them really hard, and if you've been in group therapy, you'll know what I'm talking about. To be a group of humans, at least, groups are narcissistic. Groups have narcissistic personality disorder. What does it mean? It means they're very much about inclusion and exclusion, who's in and who's out. And if you're not careful, groups will end up creating scapegoats. And I know that because I love the scapegoat position. I'm always volunteering for it, either deliberately or accidentally. I find myself in this kind of Larry David situation where trying to say the right thing is always saying exactly the wrong thing. And I'm probably doing it now, right? But I'm kind of like, in any group, there's usually an invisible poster that says, scapegoat wanted, right? And I'm like Donkey in Shrek, pick me, right? And so what Nestor's talking about here is the kinds of groups that have actually transcended that, right? The whole notion of fascism is that it's a group, right, that is about exclusion, because the fasces, right, the bundle of sticks that are held by the eagle, yeah, that's what fascism comes from. It's a bundle, right? The sticks are weak by themselves, but in this gang, they have this strength, right? So when Nestor's talking about groups of icons here, they're not gangs of icons, right? They're much more open than that. Like a single-celled organism is a group, but it's not a gang, because it has a permeable boundary, right? You have a permeable boundary. You have to be able to eat and excrete and sort of live and, right, let people in and give them hugs, and then, ooh, that's a bit too much, and always negotiating, right? And that's because intrinsically, actually, life forms are not these tight little, right? But there's a human being tendency to create groups that are extremely exclusive. And that's another thing, like, when you go in that room, you are part of a group. You feel included, even though nobody took a vote on whether you should be in there or not. Nobody interrogated you at the door, you know. You just sort of go in, and then you're in, and then you can leave, right? It sounds like nothing, but it's incredibly powerful and important, and kind of like software for how to create a much more democratic world, I feel.
A relationship.
Yeah, and a more ecologically just world, therefore. Yeah. A world based on the thing that I'm wearing around my neck.
This is a great place to
Please.
Cool.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right. If you raise your hand, I'll come to you.
Hello. Hi. Of all your portraits, how many of them are based on people that you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, I didn't count, but I started with the folks around me. It was most comfortable to start with my family and people that knew me, and and I could sit, no big deal. And then at one point I realized that when I went up to New York to visit friends, and thank you. It was a lot easier not to have somebody throw me their keys and for me to go up and visit and do the drawing and hang out and then leave and then get on the subway or something. 'Cause that was a whole day. So a friend of mine had a party for me and invited all his friends to Brooklyn. And then I drew 30 people in a few hours. That was better. Wow. But I didn't know any of them. I wanted to, but this was a way to sort of extend myself into a community where, because of I lived in a different one, this was a way to meet people and to have a meaningful interaction, because I felt like by transmission, by sitting with the person just for a little while and doing a really quick working drawing, not like a beautiful drawing, but a drawing that was appropriate for transferring to the board and then painting later, and a quick snapshot and get their name, you can learn a lot about a person and experience them without speaking. And then maybe, learn a little bit more about them later. So I look at it like Station 32. There's 32 teeth in your mouth, and that was like word of mouth. So I started with people that I knew and then extended that and did the best I could, in life circumstances to do as many well as I could. So that said, it's a continuing corpus. It's growing and growing. This strand is getting longer and longer. There are people from San Antonio, people from Houston, people from New York. I'd like to go to California and do some people. I'd like to go to, this is something I can look forward to doing now for a while, in addition to the other genres that I do with my work.
Are you still doing it currently?
Pardon me?
Are you still doing it currently?
Yes, and also, people have asked me. Somebody might ask tonight, so I'll go on about this a bit. What about if somebody wants to own their portrait? Well, they can. It's kind of like people travel about, they come and go in life. If I have a larger exhibition somewhere and I need all the portraits I have, then we'll ask people to lend them. It's that simple. So people can go through, they can go through Josh and Hiram's gallery and they can talk, you can get a portrait if you want one. I feel like there's a relation that people have if you have an interest and you're called to it somehow, then you belong in the portrait. If you feel strongly about it, then there's an attraction, and that's something that makes the thing happen. Some people are not interested, and that's fine. You don't have to be an artist. You can be someone who loves art. You can be, you should be a person, though. You have to be a person, and a good person, probably. Yeah.
Nestor is quintessentially a Houstonian, yeah, and I'm trying to be a little bit a Houstonian, and we're thinking like we are the Houstonians in a way, like hello, and maybe the thing about Houston is it is one of these very permeable groups, actually, like what makes us different from other places. That's kind of one of the things that's true about it. Nestor's doing me, he's doing me right now. Awesome.
And there have been people that I'm close to that I haven't gotten to in 25 years that I'd like to, and it's like, oh yeah, I keep forgetting, and some people I forget their names, and they come over and I forget the drawing. So, I'm probably like, maybe 80% of what I could be doing this, but I also have to forgive myself, I'm not. But it's slowly growing. The strand is growing.
Nestor, have you ever painted yourself?
That's a great question. And everybody asked me that. And I said, well, actually, no, I haven't. So this year, I found a picture of myself at age 10. I'm starting with that one. And you can see the progress. It's in the library in a vitrine. There's a lovely installation, in glass that shows the steps and the process, and something you would never see in my studio because it's, you look around and you see chaos in a bit. But it's all lined out, and I think after I finish the one at age 10, I'll move on, and I'll get one of myself in my 60s, which I haven't done yet, but yes, it's in the works.
I was curious, is there a feature of a person that you always start with when they're sitting with them that sort of you're drawn to?
Yeah, and it's a pragmatic consideration. I use different types I observe in different ways. Lately, I'll start with the eyes, and I put a dot in the corner of each eye, and a dot on the nostrils and the nose and the mouth, and I get the really quick proportions, and I make some rudimentary lines. In fact, sometimes the drawings are just a few lines, and that's all I really need. And then I can come back and I can fill them in. If I map the skull, it's almost like facial recognition, except it's not done by hardware, it's done by wetware, right? And then I can lock that in, and I can work the drawing up. Sometimes I use the Xerox machine and I shrink the drawing down, or I blow it up if I need. I use tools to sort of quicken the process. And so that answers that question. Yeah.
Just to follow up on it, if you're just doing points like that and you put it to the side, you made a comment earlier about how you're maybe feeling at a moment. Is the expression that portrait gets what you're feeling when you're doing that work? Or do you remember how that person looked at that?
I remember the interaction, and I take a photograph so I can remember the color of a person's eyes and things like that, and maybe it reminds me of the interaction. Because the drawing can't be a tonal drawing. It can't have any shading in it. It has to be a line drawing that's really simple, because the drawings are transferred to the gessoed board and then they're etched. I take a sharp needle-like stainless steel tool and I scratch along the drawing to keep it really simple. What happens after I have the drawing is it gives me an armature, and then when I do the painting, that really has a lot of freedom in it compared to the drawing. It really almost is a sort of a standard type of abstraction that happens, and often there are shapes that will appear, like this portrait of Tarkovsky, and this one of Aaron Perizet is quite frightening, actually, and it's not his fault. It's just that the painting really wanted to go, Uncle Fester. It really wanted to go Francis Bacon, and that's what happened. So there's no guarantee that somebody's going to like what happens. Just like life,
Nestor was working with me yesterday, and I've been looking at art quite seriously since I was about 8, right? And I knew who Francis Bacon was when I was like 12, right? But I was blown away by Nestor's sense of vision, right? Like things that artists can see, and the tech that they use with which to modify and adjust and deepen that. And I was like, what? I thought I knew everything. I'm your actual know-it-all academic, so it's great that Nestor taught me that I don't know anything.
It happened to me while I was working.
No.
The more we think we know,
I guess my question was, I'm a portrait photographer, or like just starting out, and so it's really cleansed sort of like my palette and how I see what I see versus what I want my ultimate outcome to be. And I guess my question was, could you tell us a little bit about the process with the colors, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned light, and you mentioned form, and you mentioned like the portrait itself and the people and what that represents. So I guess I wanted to know more about like the colors that you used.
Yeah. It follows almost a prescription, just like with icon writing, in that the earlier pigments are earth colors, and they actually move towards more precious materials as they get lighter. They start dark and they go lighter and lighter and lighter, and light comes in, right? So there's all these great metaphors, but there's also a very practical and pragmatic way to paint. So a lot of the pigments might be mixed. I use very traditional pigments, and the color comes out in layers. It's built up in transparencies. They're painted flat with a lot of water and vinegar and egg yolk as the medium, and the protein surrounds the pigment, and the vinegar cuts the protein open so that it can surround the pigment. But for instance, colors like earth colors, all the ochres are used first, dark colors like this, and then in conjunction with white lead, the lead gives it a heaviness, and it it's a warm lead, it's a warm white color, and that gets it lighter and progressively lighter and lighter. And there's transparent layers between the highlight layers of ochres, which are normally transparent anyway, and they're what give it the sort of depth in the body. And it almost looks like sfumato, you know, it almost looks like that sort of smokiness that you see in some Leonardo paintings. And that if you look at the countenance of the icon, you'll see it really looks like you're looking at them from a distance, because the dark shadows are not there. You have value and you have chroma. So the chroma is the color and the value is how light and dark it is. So the more close together shadows are to the light things, the more it seems like something is seen in an atmosphere, a sort of atmosphere. But what I'm looking at is the sort of, you can see the abstraction going on, like egg on the forehead. There's all these opportunities for things that are really counterintuitive, you know, which I think is something that fascinates me. So the colors are actually pre-established, and if you go in the library, you can see them. You can see my palette, and it's just the pigments are there. And when I want to use them, I add water to them, and then I take a little bit out of a dish, and I put that in another dish with the medium, and I use that in one day because that's the stuff that hardens it up. But the colors, until I use them up, I just add more powdered ground up pigment. The pigments are natural minerals, and I don't grind them myself. I want them really coarsely ground because that way the particles are fine and coarse, and then used in a thin wash that sinks into the gesso, they create a pattern that expresses the elements that they are. You know, an iron oxide might do something different from like a pigment that's got more clay in it, right? So there's an opportunity to create, you know, a lot of different things that the pigments, again, it's like the bricks. They tell you how they want to be used, and there's a natural way to use them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This question presumes a lot, but how do you think that the portrait stand might be seen in, say, 200 years?
That's interesting, right? I mean, remember that guy that was doing fake Vermeers, and everybody was convinced they're forgeries, right? And when we look at them now, it's like, that's not a Vermeer. How could they think that? So we sort of have this pool that we're in where we think something really stands outside it. I think these works will probably look very, very not like icons in any way, shape, or form to people, because I don't think many people are familiar so much with. So, and also, you know, I want these to be something that happens now. And in the future, I'd like it for it to be useful now in the future. You know what I mean? So I consider everything to be contemporary, in a sense. It's so liberating to have everything contemporary, everything. If we don't sort of tell ourselves, it's over here, or it was then. All the then is now too, you know? So in a way, it's a kind of a way that I don't think. I just don't think like that. But yeah.
You know what? That's a really amazing question.
It is.
Because, you know, these paintings are referring to the thing called the past, quite obviously, and they literally are the past. I mean, they all represent things that Nestor decided to do to some wood and some gesso and some gold and some paint, and he decided to put a piece of color there and a piece of color there. You're looking at the past when you're looking at these, right? But also, you're looking at the future, because who is this person? What is a person really? Does this person mean something to me? Do I mean something to me? All these questions are the future. You know, in a funny way, these paintings are like junctions like of trains, right? And one train is called the past, and the other train is called the future, and they're kind of moving past each other. And this feeling of now isn't like a dot on a Wikipedia line. It's more like this kind of relative motion feeling, like you're on a boat or like you're in a car. I get this in the car spa in Midtown, right? Like you go in there and the machinery's moving, or are you moving? right? You can't quite tell. You're sitting there, and it's as if two things are moving at the same time. You're not quite sure. There's this funny feeling of movement, and there's a gorgeous movement in these paintings, which I would personally call nowness, right? Nowness. It's more of a feeling or a feel than like a dot on a line or like a target.
When I first walked into your exhibit, I felt like someone told me to take off my shoes. That moment. Thank you for that. I will be using that and quoting you. But you've been talking about your technique, but did you have a moment when you were doing these or conceiving of this exhibit?
Yeah, it was really gratifying, and I had no idea, you know. I think I struggled for a long time, and it feels constantly like a new thing happening and familiar and yet new. So, and you know, I take my shoes off in the studio where I work, and have everybody taken their shoes off all the time. And sometimes it's difficult if somebody wears like thigh-high leather lace-up boots that are stilettos, and they have to take them off twice. Once to go, I won't say it wants to go, you know. So I almost want to pitch it to Tim on that, but I know we're having a question and answer.
No further questions, Your Honor.
So this series of portraits was inspired by icons, but have you done in the past, or do you have any interest to do real icons, I mean with saints?
Yeah, I make that distinction. I have icons that I've done, not that many. It's a very serious endeavor for me, you know. And I was trained by icon writers, and I grew up with those in the Eastern, Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So yes. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier about the eyes being very important. Both of you did at different points in the talk. Could you dig into that a little bit more deeply? Because that was my personal experience was going in, and it was almost as if I was being confronted.
Do you ever feel like you were being watched?
I was in various points indeed.
Yeah. The eyes have it.
Dig into the eyes, Nestor.
The eyes.
Right into those eyes.
You won't believe me, but in geometry, where straight lines, where lines crossing those points are all eyes. The eyes have it. The whole universe. That's not a very helpful answer, I know. But, yeah. Well, practically speaking, when painting them, if you'll notice in icons and in my portraits, that there's a line of white lead at the end. At the end of the work, there's something called life-giving lines, ojivlenia, life-giving lines that go on. And you can see in that portraits up there that around the eyes there are these like bright little shiners shining out, and lines on the forehead that right, and also on the drapery. I mean, on the garment or the clothing, you can see those. And if you want them to look to the left, you put the white to the left. If you want them to look to the right, you put them to the right. Kind of sounds like a windshield wiper, but you know, there's a way to make all of this three-dimensionality at the end happen, and that's with those final light, those white lines that have like an Indian yellow and white lead that are like the really fine sort of, you know, things. But the eyes are a certain prescript, a certain, you know, they're not the big eyes that with the cat eyes. Look at, you know, they're not there for.
I have a fun, cool thing to say that doesn't.
Yeah.
So I'm going to preface this by saying that I live across the street, right, and I'm not pointing at anyone in this room, but if you live here, there is a certain speed that some people drive around the Menil at, and I call that museum speed. And it is a most frustrating speed if you're trying to get, say, your daughter to high school and you're actually running, I'm going to go at 30 miles an hour, but the car in front of me is going at 15. Because why, right? Because they are subjected to a thing called the gaze. And I would like to make a big distinction between the gaze and what is happening in these pictures, which is looking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The gaze is the kind of the paranoid one, right? It's like zombies gaze, right? Glinting cans of Coca-Cola gaze. Little ting in the toothpaste ad from the 50s gaze, right? That's the gaze. It's this feeling of being like, I'm under the gaze of the museum, so I have to drive in a special way. Otherwise the museum will hurt me in the afterlife or something, right? Whereas these pictures that actually are in the museum, ironically, they're nothing to do with the gaze, right? They're just looking. So you feel seen. They're not surveillance cameras. They're not the gaze. And in general, I love this museum because it's really resisting that logic of the gaze. One way that it does that is by being very not a white cube. If you're going around a white cube, it's kind of like you're going around a church, right, in a bad way. This is like religion in a bad way. You have to have a special kind of silence and a special kind of distance and say special things, otherwise your person you're on a date with will hate you, and all that stuff. You're being gazed at by the museum, and especially people who don't think they're religious might actually get very religious in that setting. Ironically, these are deeply religious pictures because they don't do that to you.
This reminds me of what we were talking about when you mentioned the glittering abyss.
Oh, did I? Cool.
You said the glittering abyss, and you know how
that's a cool thing to say. I didn't say anything.
No,
it's
cool. It's great.
That's cool.
I'm going to use that in a title, by the way.
Use that? Cool.
Yes. So
I do charge a small fee.
It's okay. We'll work it out.
Yeah.
The dark at the center of each eye. There's black. There's a perfect little black oval in each one, and in some of the paintings there's an abyss that's like a void space that is like the Malevich dark circle, right? And this is something that I am not fully able to comprehend or talk about, but I can try. I don't want to be pretentious, but it's the right thing to do often in a portrait. And it is something that looks at you. And it's something that you look into, It's almost a hole in the that goes beyond and into. Sometimes I use it as an abstract shape, but it's always in the eyes also. And that's what our souls have when we're looking into this mystery of each other. This is our limitations, visually speaking,
It's very ambiguous, isn't it, though? These voids there might be someone in there, it might just be another world, but the ambiguity is what makes it into a personal thing, whereas Homeland Security is pretty unambiguous, right? It's like you're now subject to the gaze of the state, and you get in that machine, and you literally are being gazed at there by a machine, and the gaze is always a kind of machine, right? Some privileged people get to stand in that position, yeah, but these pictures are ambiguous, right? Like, is there nothing there or something there is kind of why there's something there, Like you look at, like, how can you tell I'm not an android, right? How can I tell, right? The Descartes sort of paranoia, to go back to the paranoia in the question, how do I know that I'm not just an artifact of some AI software? Actually, I don't, right? And like, how to treat people nicely, funnily enough, they might be an android, right? You never know. That's the lesson of Blade Runner, and as they say, a Blade Runner a day keeps the doctor away. And we mentioned Blade Runner yesterday, so I'm bringing it up. Muppet Show at the beginning, Blade Runner at the end. What's not to like about this?
Well, and thank you so much. We could just close out on that. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you all for coming, and have a good night.